Ibrahim Traoré's Genuius plan, free education, that is changing Africa forever. The story begins not in the classrooms of Burkina Faso, but in the imagination of a young soldier who grew up knowing the weight of poverty and the price of ignorance. Ibrahim Traoré, before becoming the leader of his nation, was not groomed in luxury, nor was he the product of elite institutions. He was shaped by dust roads, crowded schools, and the voices of children who dropped out far too early because their families could not afford the fees. When Traoré rose to power, the world expected him to talk about weapons, alliances, or oil. Instead, he stunned the international stage with a radical declaration: education shall be free, compulsory, and equal for every child of Burkina Faso, from the first day of primary school until the gates of university. It was more than a law. It was a cultural revolution. For decades, African education systems had been locked in an outdated model: endless exams, rigid memorization, overcrowded classrooms, and teachers forced to deliver the same dry curriculum. The poor were left behind. Talent was wasted. A farmer's child could dream of becoming a doctor, but tuition fees or a lack of support would crush that dream. Traoré saw this cycle and asked one simple question: what if the classroom became the battlefield where nations win or lose their future? His answer was bold: abolish tuition fees across the entire system, make school attendance legally compulsory, and rebuild the education model from the ground up. Instead of worshipping test scores, Burkina Faso would cultivate creativity, critical thinking, and innovation. Imagine a village in the Sahel, where once children were sent to herd goats instead of attending school. Now, by law, they enter bright classrooms, equipped with solar-powered digital boards. Teachers, no longer trapped by bureaucratic handbooks, guide their students with freedom and creativity. Girls, who once were forced to leave school early for marriage or domestic work, now continue their studies with full state protection. The world did not believe it at first. Critics said it was impossible, too expensive, too ambitious, too idealistic. But Traoré was not a man who followed the script of doubt. He mobilized national resources reclaimed from mining contracts, once held by foreign corporations. He redirected military budgets, arguing that the most powerful weapon a nation can build is an educated generation. Within 3 years, enrollment rates skyrocketed. Dropouts nearly disappeared. Parents who once saw school as an unaffordable luxury now considered it a birthright. But more importantly, the quality of education itself transformed. Burkina Faso's system was designed not to copy Europe or Asia, but to serve African realities. Local languages were respected. Curriculum included agriculture, engineering, and modern sciences, but also art, history, and civic education. Teachers became the backbone of this revolution. Traoré granted them unprecedented autonomy. No longer were they exam machines. They became mentors, innovators, and nation builders. Salaries were increased, training programs were expanded, and communities celebrated their teachers as leaders equal in importance to generals or ministers. And the results began to show. Students in Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso were building robots from recycled metal. Young women from rural provinces were coding apps to help farmers track rainfall. Teenagers were organizing debates about climate change, technology, and the future of Africa. For the first time, the dream of becoming an engineer, scientist, or entrepreneur was no longer reserved for the wealthy elite. It was accessible to anyone with passion and persistence. Burkina Faso quickly became the intellectual heartbeat of West Africa. Universities filled with students not only from Burkina, but also from neighboring countries seeking quality education at a fraction of the cost they would pay abroad. International scholars who once ignored the landlocked nation now traveled there to witness a miracle in progress. And yet, Traoré did not frame it as a miracle. He called it common sense. He reminded his people that the mineral wealth of the land was useless if the minds of the youth were left undeveloped. Diamonds will be exhausted, he said, but knowledge multiplies itself forever. On the global stage, policymakers began to notice. Journalists compared Burkina Faso's model to Finland's revolutionary education system. African leaders debated whether they too could afford to scrap tuition fees entirely. NGOs who once criticized the country's poverty were suddenly pointing to it as a model of progress. For the people of Burkina Faso, the impact was not measured in statistics but in stories. Blaitis, a farmer in Coldrugo, proudly told reporters that all 4 of his children were the first in his family to read and write. A young girl from a once-forgotten desert town entered medical school with dreams of returning to build a hospital in her village. A group of students who once studied under trees created a solar-powered drone for agricultural monitoring, winning an international prize. This was not charity. This was sovereignty. Traoré's education policy became the embodiment of his political philosophy. Independence is not only about borders or resources, it is about minds. A nation dependent on foreign aid or imported expertise would never truly be free. But a nation of thinkers, creators, and innovators could no longer be ignored. Thus, the classrooms of Burkina Faso became the front line of a larger war, not of guns, but of ideas. Every textbook, every experiment, every child who stood up to speak was proof that a small African nation could defy centuries of neglect and reimagine itself. And as the first wave of graduates stepped into society, something extraordinary happened. The economy itself began to shift. Industries that once imported foreign experts now recruited locally trained professionals. Young startups began to sprout, funded not by foreign investors, but by communities pooling resources to support their brightest youth. By choosing education over everything else, Traoré had planted a seed that would not only grow in Burkina Faso, but spread across Africa. The second stage of Ibrahim Traoré's educational revolution was not just about schools. It was about reshaping the very fabric of society. Once the foundation of free and compulsory education was laid, the effects began to ripple outward, touching families, communities, and entire industries. The vision was clear. If every child in Burkina Faso could receive high-quality education without financial barriers, then every citizen could eventually contribute to the nation's collective strength. This was no longer a dream. It was becoming reality. Families that once debated whether to send their children to work in the fields or to school now had no choice but to honor the law. And with time, they came to celebrate it. Parents began to understand that education was not stealing their children from labor, but returning them as doctors, engineers, teachers, and leaders. The image of children in uniform walking to school across dusty paths became a symbol of national pride, one that resonated far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. Equality became the most radical outcome of this policy. In a society once divided by wealth, class, and gender, classrooms became the first true space where everyone sat side by side. The daughter of a farmer could sit next to the son of a minister, and both would receive the same instruction, the same resources, the same opportunities. For the first time, education ceased to be a privilege. It became a right fully protected by the state. This shift dramatically improved gender equality. Girls who once faced early marriage or domestic expectations were now shielded by law to remain in school. Community campaigns led by women educators spread the message, educating a girl is educating a nation. Over time, female enrollment rates matched, and in some regions even surpassed, those of boys. This change alone began to alter the dynamics of society. Women who had been confined to domestic roles were now stepping into positions of leadership, their authority backed not only by knowledge, but by the legitimacy of the state's vision. Teachers became cultural heroes. With newfound autonomy and better salaries, they rose to become the most respected figures in local communities. In villages, the arrival of a new teacher was celebrated as much as the arrival of a new doctor or engineer. Traoré insisted that teachers should have freedom to design lessons according to the needs of their students, and this freedom sparked creativity never seen before. Some schools integrated local crafts into engineering classes, others taught coding alongside traditional farming techniques, merging the wisdom of the past with the demands of the future. Out of this educational ferment emerged the first wave of innovators. University students, trained under the compulsory and free system, began tackling real problems with real solutions. In Ouagadougou, a group of engineering students developed low-cost solar panels using recycled metals. In Bobo Dioulasso, medical students created a telehealth platform connecting rural clinics to urban hospitals. These were not projects to impress foreign donors. They were homegrown answers to homegrown challenges. Society itself became more literate, more informed, more resistant to manipulation. Citizens who once struggled to read political pamphlets or understand economic policies were now empowered to question, to analyze, to hold leaders accountable. The political culture shifted. In villages where decisions were once made by a few elders, young people educated under the new system began to participate actively, bringing fresh ideas and demanding transparency. Traoré had long argued that democracy without education was fragile. But democracy with education was unbreakable. Economically, the effects were undeniable. Within a decade, Burkina Faso witnessed a surge in local entrepreneurship. Small businesses emerged across sectors: agriculture, technology, manufacturing, fueled by graduates who combined theoretical knowledge with practical skills. The nation began producing not just laborers, but thinkers and builders. International investors who once overlooked Burkina Faso suddenly turned their eyes toward a society that was producing a consistent stream of capable, ambitious, and innovative young people. And unlike previous generations, these youth were not leaving in massive waves to seek opportunity abroad. They stayed, determined to transform their own land. The ripple effect extended even further. Countries across Africa began sending delegations to study Burkina Faso's model. Leaders from East and Central Africa admitted publicly that they were inspired. The idea that a small landlocked country could become a hub of intellectual development stunned the global stage, and Traoré welcomed it with humility. He often repeated, "This is not just for us. This is for Africa." The compulsory and free education system was more than a policy. It was a new national identity. Children grew up not seeing themselves as victims of poverty or as dependents of foreign aid, but as citizens of a nation where knowledge was the most valuable currency. This psychological transformation may have been the greatest achievement of all. The classroom doors did not simply open to let in students. They opened to let out a new generation of nation builders. The third chapter of Ibrahim Traoré's education revolution revealed itself when the first generation of students, nurtured under free and compulsory schooling, began to enter universities and professional fields with confidence, vision, and a sense of responsibility to their nation. What was once dismissed as an idealistic experiment was now driving real economic transformation. In Burkina Faso's capital, research centers began buzzing with activity as young scientists tested new agricultural methods, engineers designed energy solutions, and economists drafted strategies for self-reliant growth. Unlike many nations where education was treated as a path to escape to foreign jobs, Traoré's Burkina Faso cultivated a culture of staying, building, and innovating at home. Students trained in technology programs were not simply learning coding from books. They were building mobile applications that allowed farmers to predict rainfall patterns and optimize irrigation. Medical graduates did not just memorize diseases from textbooks. They created low-cost diagnostic tools from local materials to serve rural clinics. Artists and historians, often sidelined in other systems, became key voices in shaping a national identity rooted in pride and independence, showing that creativity and innovation were not limited to science alone, but spread across all human expression. This ecosystem of innovation was not accidental. It was deliberately designed by Traoré's vision of education. By freeing schools from the tyranny of standardized tests and rote memorization, students were encouraged to experiment, to fail, and to try again. Teachers were rewarded for inspiring curiosity rather than drilling for scores. Laboratories replaced exam halls as the measure of success. Burkina Faso's universities, once struggling to attract attention, became vibrant hubs where ideas flowed freely, and collaboration between disciplines flourished. One striking example came from a team of engineering and agricultural students who developed a drone powered by solar energy that could monitor desertification and deliver seeds to arid land. Their invention won recognition at an international innovation fair, but more importantly, it was deployed locally, turning barren fields into arable land. These were not distant dreams. They were practical solutions born from classrooms where children had once sat barefoot under trees. The transformation extended beyond technology. A group of sociology students launched community cooperatives that combined microfinance with literacy training, lifting entire villages out of dependency. Law students created public advocacy groups to protect citizens' rights, spreading awareness that education was not just about jobs, but about empowerment. This wave of innovation reshaped the economy. Burkina Faso moved away from being a raw material exporter toward becoming a knowledge-driven society. Startups multiplied in the fields of renewable energy, agri-tech, and healthcare. International investors began to notice, but this time negotiations were different. The new generation of educated leaders demanded partnerships on equal terms rather than exploitative contracts. They understood the value of their ideas, their land, and their labor, and they no longer allowed foreign companies to dictate the rules. Innovation, once a distant word associated with Silicon Valley or European laboratories, was now part of Burkina Faso's everyday vocabulary. Villages spoke proudly of their local inventors. Towns celebrated science fairs like national holidays. Even traditional elders, once skeptical, began to support schools with land and resources, realizing that the survival of their communities depended not only on heritage, but also on the creativity of the youth. Regionally, Burkina Faso's rise as an educational power shook assumptions about what was possible in Africa. Students from neighboring countries flocked to its universities, drawn by low costs and high-quality training. Some chose to stay, integrating into Burkina Faso's workforce, while others returned home carrying the seeds of change. Traoré's vision was spreading across borders, proving that one nation's bold step could ignite continental transformation. International institutions could no longer ignore this new reality. Reports by global think tanks pointed to Burkina Faso as an example of how education reform could unlock development more effectively than foreign aid. Commentators described the nation as the Finland of Africa, though locals rejected the comparison, insisting that Burkina Faso was not copying anyone but writing its own story. Through it all, Traoré maintained his focus. He reminded his people that innovation was not about competing with others, but about serving the needs of the nation. He often repeated, "If we can grow food in the desert, heal our sick with our own hands, and power our homes with our own sun, then we are free." These words resonated not only as policy, but as philosophy. By the end of the first decade of compulsory free education, Burkina Faso's GDP began reflecting the impact. Knowledge industries, once non-existent, contributed significantly to growth. More importantly, social cohesion strengthened. Crime rates fell, political engagement increased, and citizens began to see themselves as active participants in shaping their nation's destiny rather than passive recipients of government decrees. In short, education had become the engine of innovation, and innovation had become the fuel for sovereignty. By the time Ibrahim Traoré's education policy reached its maturity, Burkina Faso was no longer simply educating its children. It was educating the continent. Delegations from across Africa and beyond arrived to study what many called the Burkina Model. Presidents, ministers, and policymakers walked through classrooms in Ouagadougou, astonished at how a country once described as among the poorest on earth had built one of the most advanced and equitable education systems in the world. What impressed them most was not the infrastructure, though modern schools with solar panels and digital labs had spread even into remote villages, but the philosophy. Traoré had refused to let his nation's future be defined by grades, rankings, or external validation. Instead, he built a system rooted in dignity, equality, and creativity. This philosophy resonated deeply across Africa, where too many children still dropped out due to fees, gender inequality, or outdated teaching. Governments began sending teams to adapt Burkina Faso's methods: free access, compulsory attendance, teacher autonomy, and curricula that combined science with local culture. Slowly, the wave spread. In West Africa, nations began removing tuition fees. In Central Africa, teacher training programs were redesigned. In East Africa, debates about compulsory education cited Burkina Faso as proof that bold reforms were possible. International organizations, once skeptical, now shifted their tone. Reports from UNESCO and the African Union praised Burkina Faso for demonstrating that education could be the foundation of sovereignty and development. Foreign universities signed exchange agreements, not to give aid but to learn, eager to study how a resource-limited nation could outperform wealthy states in innovation. This reversal of roles was revolutionary. For the first time, Africa was not copying but leading. At home, the impact went beyond classrooms and GDP figures. A new culture of self-respect emerged. Young people who once dreamed only of emigrating now dreamed of building businesses, institutions, and communities inside their homeland. Parents who once measured success by sending children abroad now proudly watch them graduate from national universities and create jobs for others. Burkina Faso cities began to glow with the energy of youth-led enterprises, while its villages became centers of applied learning, where students and teachers worked together to solve local problems. It was no longer unusual to see teenagers designing clean water systems or university graduates launching agricultural cooperatives that employed entire communities. This was education alive, not locked in books but breathing in every corner of society. Traoré himself never allowed the system to stagnate. He constantly pushed for reform, urging educators and policymakers to adapt to new challenges. When artificial intelligence became a global trend, Burkina Faso was among the first African nations to integrate AI ethics and coding into secondary schools. When climate change threatened crops, research programs in universities developed drought-resistant seeds that spread across the Sahel. This agility kept the system relevant and positioned Burkina Faso not as a follower, but as a pioneer in global problem-solving. Yet perhaps the greatest achievement was psychological. Generations raised under this model grew up believing that they were equal to anyone in the world. They no longer carried the inferiority complex of colonization, or the dependency mindset of foreign aid. In their minds, Burkina Faso was not small, not weak, not poor. It was sovereign, innovative, and capable of leading. And this confidence proved contagious. Across Africa, students began to chant slogans inspired by Burkina Faso's movement. Knowledge is freedom. Every child in school. Every mind free. Education for dignity, not for debt. From Lagos to Nairobi, from Dhaka to Kinshasa, the idea spread that compulsory and free education was not a dream but a right, achievable with political courage. On the world stage, Burkina Faso became a symbol of defiance and hope. When Traoré addressed international summits, he spoke not with the tone of a supplicant, but with the authority of a leader who had delivered results. His speeches carried a simple but powerful message. We chose books over bullets, and we became stronger. We chose equality over privilege, and we became freer. We chose to invest in our children, and we invested in eternity. These words struck audiences not as rhetoric, but as undeniable truth, backed by the transformation of an entire nation. Today, the Burkina model continues to expand, proving that one leader's vision, rooted in personal experience and national pride, can reshape not only a country but a continent. Ibrahim Traoré's policy of compulsory and free education stands as one of the greatest social revolutions of the 21st century, a beacon showing that sovereignty begins not in parliaments or armies, but in classrooms filled with children who dare to dream. And as these children grow into innovators, leaders, and guardians of their culture, they carry forward a lesson that the world cannot ignore. The true wealth of a nation lies not under its soil, but within its people. Ibrahim Traoré transformed Burkina Faso with a bold vision: free, compulsory education from primary school to university. His system replaced rote memorization with creativity, equality, and teacher autonomy, turning classrooms into engines of innovation. Girls gained equal opportunities. Teachers became national heroes, and students built solutions for real challenges. The Burkina model soon inspired nations across Africa and earned global recognition. Traoré proved that sovereignty begins in classrooms, and knowledge is the true wealth of a nation.